At Arlington National Cemetery, where silence speaks louder than words, the tomb of the unknown soldier stands as a place of deep honor and respect. Every step taken by the tomb guard is measured, practiced, and filled with meaning. Among those guards was Sergeant Daniel Cole, a man known for his steady hands, perfect posture, and quiet pride in what he did. He had trained for years to earn that position, where even the smallest mistake could mean being replaced. For Daniel, guarding the tomb wasn't just a job, it was a sacred promise. Every morning before the sun touched the white marble, Daniel would prepare his uniform with great care. His shoes were polished until they shone like glass. His belt was aligned perfectly, his weapon spotless, and his face calm. Tourists would often visit to watch the changing of the guard, amazed at the precision and discipline of these soldiers. But few truly understood the weight that came with that honor. For Daniel, every second on duty was about showing respect to those who never made it home, those whose names would never be known. On a cool autumn morning, the crowd was larger than usual. The air was crisp and the sky held a pale golden light. Daniel stood tall at his post, his eyes forward, not moving even slightly as dozens of people stood behind the barrier in quiet awe. He could hear the faint sound of leaves brushing against the stone path, the whisper of cameras being lifted, and the soft breathing of those who came to watch. As he walked his 21 steps down the mat, turned sharply, paused for 21 seconds, then returned. Everything felt as it should, until something caught his attention. Out of the corner of his eye, Daniel noticed a woman standing near the front of the crowd. She was older, perhaps in her late 50s, dressed in a dark blue coat. Her hands trembled slightly as she held something close to her chest. Even without looking directly, Daniel could sense something heavy in her presence. Her shoulders were shaking and her head was bowed. She was crying. Now a tomb guard must never break focus. They are trained to block out every distraction, no matter what happens. But something about this woman made it impossible for Daniel to ignore her. He could see just faintly that she was holding a folded American flag. That sight hit him deeply. It was the kind of flag given to families when a loved one in uniform dies serving the country. As Daniel continued his measured walk, his heart began to pound beneath his uniform. His thoughts started to slip away from the rhythm of his duty. He remembered his own friend, a fellow soldier named Tom who had once served beside him overseas. Tom never made it home. Daniel still carried the memory of standing at his friend's funeral, watching that same folded flag being handed to Tom's mother. The look in her eyes that day was something Daniel could never forget, and now, in front of the tomb, he saw that same pain reflected in this woman's face. The guard's movements continued flawlessly, but inside, Daniel was struggling. Every rule, every line of the manual told him to stay silent, to keep marching. But his heart whispered something else, that maybe silence wasn't enough this time. The woman's quiet sobs grew louder. She pressed the flag tighter against her chest and whispered something Daniel couldn't hear. Then suddenly her knees seemed to give out and she crouched low, unable to stand under the weight of her grief. Gasps rose from the onlookers. For a split second, Daniel hesitated. He wasn't supposed to stop. He wasn't supposed to speak. But at that moment, none of that seemed to matter. He took a slow breath, stepped forward, and paused his march. The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. People stared in disbelief as the tomb guard, the soldier known for never breaking formation, turned his head slightly toward the crying woman. His voice was calm but filled with emotion as he said softly, "Ma'am, your son will never be forgotten. Not here, not ever." The woman froze, her eyes wide. Tears streamed down her face, but she nodded, holding the flag close. A few people in the crowd began to cry quietly. Others stood completely still, unsure if what they were seeing was real. Daniel held his position for a few moments longer, then slowly turned back, resuming his march with the same precision as before. No one dared to speak after that. When the ceremony ended, the crowd didn't clap or cheer. They simply watched in silence, moved by what they had witnessed. For Daniel, it felt like a small act of comfort, something human in a place of great formality. But he didn't know then that his moment of compassion would soon cause a storm far beyond the gates of the cemetery. Later that day, someone uploaded a video of the moment online. Within hours, it spread everywhere. People shared it with captions like "The Guard Who Broke Silence" and "A Moment of Humanity at Arlington." Some praised him, saying he showed true heart. Others criticized him for breaking strict military rules. When the report reached his superiors, Daniel was called in for questioning. They told him the matter was being taken seriously. The ceremony at the tomb was bound by unbreakable tradition. No words, no reactions, no emotions. Breaking that could be seen as disrespect. Daniel stood at attention as they told him he might face a formal hearing. That night, alone in his small quarters, Daniel sat quietly with his uniform folded beside him. He replayed the moment in his mind. The trembling woman, the folded flag, and the words that had come from somewhere deep inside him. He knew the rules, but he also knew why he had done it. He had seen pain too raw to ignore. He had spoken not as a soldier, but as a human being. Outside, the night air was cool and still. Daniel looked toward the cemetery, the rows of white headstones faintly visible in the moonlight. Somewhere among them lay his friend Tom and countless others like him. Daniel whispered softly, "I did what I thought was right." But he also knew the coming days would not be easy. The army valued order and respect above all, and in their eyes he had crossed a line. What he didn't yet know was that his act, though simple and heartfelt, was about to reach people across the country. It would lead to a courtroom, a confrontation with a judge, and a moment that would test not just his career, but the meaning of honor itself. And as the lights of Arlington flickered in the distance, Sergeant Daniel Cole prepared himself for whatever came next, unaware that his single sentence of kindness would soon echo through the hearts of millions. The next few weeks felt heavy for Sergeant Daniel Cole. Every morning he reported for duty as usual, but the calm pride he once felt had turned into quiet worry. The video of him speaking during the ceremony was now being discussed on news channels and social media everywhere. Some called him a hero for showing compassion, while others said he had broken one of the most sacred military traditions. Daniel didn't try to defend himself. He simply waited for the official call. And one day it came. He was to appear before a military hearing to explain his actions. The news spread quickly among his fellow soldiers. Some saluted him quietly in respect, while others avoided his eyes, afraid to be seen taking sides. Inside, Daniel stayed calm, but his thoughts wouldn't stop racing. He replayed the moment again and again, wondering if he could have done anything differently. But no matter how much he thought, he always reached the same answer. He would do it again if he had to. The morning of the hearing arrived. The courtroom was inside a grand old building filled with echoes of footsteps and the faint smell of polished wood. Rows of soldiers in uniform sat silently watching. Family members of veterans and reporters filled the back rows. In the front sat the military judge, Colonel James Matthews, a man known for his strict discipline and deep respect for tradition. His expression was firm, his eyes steady behind a pair of thin glasses. When Daniel entered, the room went silent. He walked to the front with slow, steady steps, his uniform crisp and his face calm. Even though his heart was heavy, he stood tall. The judge nodded slightly. "Sergeant Daniel Cole," he said in a deep voice, "you stand accused of breaking ceremonial protocol during your duty at the tomb of the unknown soldier. How do you plead?" Daniel took a breath and said clearly, "I do not deny my actions, sir." The room murmured. The judge raised an eyebrow. "So you admit you spoke during your watch?" "Yes, sir," Daniel replied. "I did speak." The judge leaned back slightly. "Then explain to this court why you felt it necessary to break one of our most sacred duties. A duty that represents silence, respect, and perfection." Daniel hesitated for a moment, then turned his head toward the audience. There, sitting in the second row, was the same woman from that day. She wore the same dark blue coat and still held the folded flag in her hands. Her eyes met his, filled with both sadness and gratitude. That gave him strength. "Sir," Daniel began, his voice steady but soft, "I've stood at that post hundreds of times. I've faced rain, snow, and burning heat without moving an inch. I've done my duty with pride. But that day something was different." The judge watched him closely as Daniel continued. "I saw a woman crying near the barrier. She was holding a folded flag, the kind we hand to the families of the fallen. I saw her trembling, and I could see in her eyes the same pain I once saw in a mother at a funeral. The mother of my best friend. That memory never left me. I saw that same pain again in her face. I knew she had lost someone she loved deeply." He paused for a moment, the silence of the courtroom growing heavier. "Sir, I know the rules. I know we are trained to be silent, to show perfect discipline. But in that moment I felt silence wasn't enough. She needed to know that her son's sacrifice meant something. So I turned to her and said, "Ma'am, your son will never be forgotten, not here, not ever." The judge stayed quiet for several seconds. The audience sat motionless. Even the sound of pens stopped. Daniel's simple words filled the room like a quiet echo. Then the prosecutor, a young officer, stood up. "With respect, Sergeant, your feelings do not change the rules. The tomb is guarded with absolute discipline. If everyone followed emotion, there would be chaos. The moment we allow exceptions, we dishonor the standard that so many before us have upheld." Daniel nodded slowly. "I understand, sir. But I also believe that respect is not just about silence, it's about compassion. The tomb represents those who gave their lives for others, and that day, I felt the best way to honor that sacrifice was to comfort someone living with the pain of it." The judge looked down at the papers in front of him, his face unreadable. The prosecutor sat down and the room grew still again. Suddenly, a quiet voice rose from the audience. It was the woman in the blue coat. "Your Honor," she said softly, standing up, "may I speak?" Colonel Matthews hesitated, then nodded. "You may." The woman clutched her flag and stepped forward. Her voice shook as she began. "My name is Margaret Lane, and the soldier who died was my son David. He was only 23. He loved his country more than anything. When he was killed, I felt like the world had ended. I came to Arlington because I didn't know where else to go. I wanted to see the tomb, to feel close to something that still had meaning." Her eyes filled with tears, but she went on. "That day I couldn't hold my tears. I didn't care who saw me. And then Sergeant Cole stopped his march, looked right at me and said those words. Those few words brought me more peace than anything else since my son's death. It reminded me that his sacrifice still mattered, that someone still cared." She turned toward Daniel. "He didn't disrespect the tomb, he honored it, and he honored my son." The courtroom was completely silent. Some of the soldiers in the audience wiped their eyes discreetly. Even the judge seemed to be deep in thought, his hands folded in front of him. After a long pause, Colonel Matthews finally spoke. "Sergeant Cole, you have shown this court that your decision came not from disrespect but from compassion. The tomb stands for honor, but also for humanity. Sometimes duty and heart must meet." Daniel stood silently, his chest rising and falling with relief. The judge continued, "You did break protocol, but you also reminded us of what that protocol represents, the love and sacrifice of those who served. Therefore, this court will not punish you. The charges are dismissed." Gasps of surprise spread through the room, followed by quiet applause. Margaret Lane covered her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Daniel saluted the judge, who returned it with a nod of deep respect. In that moment, everyone in the courtroom knew they had witnessed something special. Not a rule being broken, but a reminder that even in the strictest places, compassion still has a place. Daniel walked out of the courtroom that day with his head high. He didn't see himself as a hero, just as a soldier who did what he felt was right. But the story was far from over. The media picked it up again, and now people weren't arguing about rules. They were talking about kindness, about the power of one small act to touch hearts. Outside the courthouse, as Daniel stepped into the sunlight, Margaret Lane approached him. She smiled gently and said, "My son would have been proud of you." Daniel looked at her, humbled, and replied, "Ma'am, it's men like him who make what I do worth it." They stood there for a moment, silent but connected by something far deeper than words, a shared understanding of sacrifice, honor, and humanity. The story of Sergeant Daniel Cole's hearing spread quickly beyond the courtroom. Within hours, newspapers, television channels, and online platforms were talking about the soldier who chose compassion over protocol. Some headlines called him the guard with a heart. Others said, "Discipline meets humanity at Arlington." People from all walks of life began sharing the story, and for the first time in weeks, Daniel felt the weight on his shoulders begin to lift. When he returned to Arlington National Cemetery, the air felt different. The guards who had once looked at him with quiet uncertainty now nodded at him with respect. Even the senior officers who valued rules above everything gave him small smiles as he passed. Daniel didn't feel proud, he just felt grateful. He had done what his heart told him was right, and somehow it had touched others too. A few days later, Daniel was called into Colonel Matthews' office. The same judge who had dismissed the case stood by the window, looking out at the rows of white headstones glimmering under the morning sun. He turned slowly and smiled faintly. "Sergeant Cole," he said, "I want you to know that what you did will not be forgotten. You reminded us that even the strictest rules must still serve their true purpose, to honor the people we stand for. Daniel stood at attention. Thank you, sir. I only did what I felt was right. The colonel nodded. That's what makes it right, he said simply. Then after a pause, he added, You'll continue your duty at the tomb. The public needs to see that respect and compassion can walk side by side. When Daniel walked back onto the ceremonial grounds for the first time after the trial, hundreds of visitors were waiting. Normally, the crowd stood in quiet respect, but that day something unexpected happened. As Daniel took his position and began his slow, perfect march, a soft wave of applause rippled through the audience. It wasn't loud or disrespectful, it was gentle, full of admiration. For a brief moment, Daniel stopped and looked toward the crowd. He didn't speak, but a small nod from him said everything. Among the people watching was Margaret Lane. She had come quietly, carrying a single white flower. After the ceremony, she walked to the barrier and placed the flower near the tomb. Daniel noticed her from a distance and gave a respectful salute. She smiled, tears in her eyes, and whispered, Thank you, though he couldn't hear it. Over the next few weeks, Daniel received letters from across the country. Veterans, families, students, even children who had seen the video. One letter read, You reminded us that soldiers are not machines. You showed us that strength can be gentle. Another said, My brother served and I cried watching what you did. Thank you for showing kindness in a world that often forgets it. Daniel kept those letters carefully in a box, reading them when he felt uncertain or tired. He never wanted fame and he didn't see himself as special. He believed any soldier in his place might have done the same thing if they had seen the pain in that woman's eyes. Still, it meant something to know his action had inspired others to care a little more. One afternoon, a reporter came to interview him. The reporter asked, Sergeant Cole, how does it feel to be known as the soldier who broke the rules for compassion? Daniel smiled gently and shook his head. I didn't break them to get attention, he said. I just followed what I believe every soldier stands for, to protect, to honor, and to care. The tomb represents those who gave everything. I think the best way to honor them is not just through silence, but through understanding. His words touched many hearts once again. The interview spread across the country, and people began visiting the tomb not just to see the ceremony, but to feel the message behind it. Parents brought their children and told them, that soldier taught the world what true respect means. In time, even the Army made a quiet change. They didn't rewrite the rule book, but they introduced a new line in the training manual. A guard must uphold honor with discipline and compassion. It wasn't a huge change, but it was a reminder of Daniel's lesson, that real respect comes from the heart. Months passed and the seasons changed. The trees around Arlington turned from green to golden brown, then to bare branches covered in snow. Daniel continued his watch step by step, never missing a beat. The crowds were sometimes small, sometimes large, but he treated every ceremony with the same care. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned soft pink, Margaret Lane visited again. She stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, her hands clasped together. After the ceremony, when the crowd began to leave, she waited until Daniel had stepped off duty. She approached him and said, I wanted you to know, because of what you did, I've started speaking at local schools about my son and what he stood for. You gave me strength to share his story instead of hiding my pain. Daniel's eyes softened. That's wonderful, ma'am. He'd be proud of you, she smiled. And he'd be proud of you, too. They stood there for a moment, two people brought together by loss, kindness, and understanding. Around them, the cemetery was peaceful. The wind rustled gently through the trees, and the faint echo of footsteps from another guard filled the air. As Margaret walked away, Daniel looked back at the tomb. The marble seemed to glow in the fading light. He thought about all the soldiers resting there, unknown to the world but never forgotten. And he realized something. Rules can guide actions, but only the heart can give them meaning. From that day forward, visitors who came to Arlington often asked about the guard who had once spoken. Some said they could still feel something special in the air, a quiet reminder that honor is not only about silence or perfection, but about empathy. Years later, when Daniel finally retired from service, a small ceremony was held in his honor. He stood once again before the tomb, older now, his hair slightly gray but his eyes steady and kind. Colonel Matthews, now retired himself, attended as a guest. He shook Daniel's hand and said, "You left a mark on this place that time won't erase." Daniel smiled humbly. "Sir, I just did what any soldier should, showed a little humanity." The colonel nodded. "And that, Sergeant, is exactly why you'll never be forgotten." As the ceremony ended and the crowd quietly left, Daniel stood alone for a moment, gazing at the tomb. The same stillness surrounded him as on the day he first stood guard. He whispered softly, "Not here, not ever," repeating the words that had changed his life and touched countless others. Then he turned, took one last look and walked away, not as a man who broke protocol, but as one who reminded the world that even in silence, compassion can speak louder than words.